Hello everyone, Miss Hancock here again with another story for you. Now, if you like magic, fantasy and adventure, you're in for a treat with this one. It's about a boy who can fly. He never grows up. He spends his childhood having adventures in a magical place where he meets pirates, mermaids, Native Americans, fairies, and he takes a few ordinary children along with him too. Yes, you've probably guessed it. It's Peter Pan. Now, before we start, just a couple of things. Native Americans are the people who have lived in America for hundreds and hundreds of years. But when Christopher Columbus, the famous explorer, sailed across the ocean and landed in America, he thought he was in India. So he called the people Indians. And the name just stuck, really. But nowadays, we refer to them as Native Americans. Now, let me explain what this is. It's called a thimble, and it's something that's used by people who are sewing with a very sharp needle. Because if you are trying to put a needle through a thick piece of fabric, it could easily stab your finger. So the thimble is there to protect it. And you'll hear this word in the story in the beginning. These next two words won't be new to you, but in this story they're used in a different way because it was written over 100 years ago in Victorian times. And in those days, wealthy people had nurses to look after their children. Now, these are not the kind of nurses that we think of today, not nurses in hospitals, but they called nurses, we'd call them nannies or childminders now, people, usually women, who looked after the children while the parents were working or busy doing other things. When a nursery is mentioned in this story, it doesn't mean the kind of nursery where you would take babies or young children that we have today, or a nursery that's attached to a school maybe before reception. The nursery in this story just means the children's bedroom. That's it. So let's get started, shall we? All children except one grow up. Wendy knew she would grow up when she was 2 years old. She was playing in the garden and must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand on her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" So Wendy knew that 2 is the beginning of the end. Mr. and Mrs. Darling lived in Bloomsbury in London at number 14 with Wendy, John and Michael. You might have seen them going to Miss Fullerton's kindergarten school, accompanied by their nurse. As they were not rich, this nurse was a prim Newfoundland dog called Nana. There never was a simpler, happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up the children's minds after they were asleep, as is the nightly custom of every good mother. Occasionally she found things she could not understand, but quite the most strange of these was the word Peter. "Who is he, my pet?" she asked Wendy. "Oh, he's Peter Pan, you know, Mother." One morning some leaves had been found on the nursery floor. "It is that Peter again," said Wendy. "Whatever do you mean?" asked Mrs. Darling. Well, Wendy explained that she thought Peter sometimes came to the nursery in the night, sat at the foot of her bed and played his pipes to her. She never woke up, so she didn't know how she knew. She just knew. "I think he gets in through the window," she said. "But my dear, it is 3 floors up," said Mrs. Darling, thinking Wendy had been dreaming. But the very next night, Mrs. Darling was dozing by the nursery fire. The window blew open and a boy dropped onto the floor. He was accompanied by a strange light which darted about the room, and it was this light that woke Mrs. Darling. She started up with a cry, "Oh!" and somehow she knew at once that the boy was Peter Pan. He was a lovely boy, clothed in leaves and the juices that ooze out of trees. But the most entrancing thing about him was that he had all his first baby teeth. When he saw Mrs. Darling was a grown-up, he gnashed his little pearls at her. Mrs. Darling screamed. Nana entered, growled and sprang at the boy, who leapt out through the window. When Mrs. Darling ran down to the street to look for his body, she could see nothing but what she thought was a shooting star. Mrs. Darling returned to the nursery and found Nana with something in her mouth. Nana had closed the window too late to catch the boy, but had trapped his shadow. Mrs. Darling decided to roll up the shadow and put it in a drawer. Well, a week later, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were going out to dinner at their neighbours at number 27. Mrs. Darling came into the nursery wearing her evening gown, while Nana was trying to put the children to bed. "I don't want to go to bed," said Michael. "I don't want to go." Now, Mr. Darling came rushing in with a crumpled bow tie in his hand. "Oh, this tie is making me so cross I can't tie it properly," he yelled. "Let me try, my dear," said Mrs. Darling, and she tied the tie for him. So then Mr. Darling calmed down a bit, and Mrs. Darling felt this was an opportunity to tell him all about Peter. At first, he pooh-poohed the whole story. Rubbish. But he became thoughtful when she showed him the shadow. They whispered about it until Nana came in with Michael's medicine. "I don't want medicine," Michael cried. "Michael," said Mr. Darling, "when I was your age, I took my medicine without a complaint. And I would take it now if I hadn't lost the bottle." "Oh, I know where it is," Wendy cried, and was off before he could stop her. "Oh, Michael first," Mr. Darling said. "No, Daddy first," said Michael. "Why not take it at the same time?" said Wendy. 1, 2, 3. Well, Michael took his medicine. Mr. Darling slipped his behind his back. "Oh, Daddy," Wendy exclaimed. "Look here," he said when Nana had gone into the bathroom. "I've just thought of a splendid joke. I shall pour my medicine into Nana's bowl." Nana returned, wagged her tail and began lapping at the bowl. Then she gave Mr. Darling a funny look and crept into her kennel. "Oh, it was only a joke," Mr. Darling roared as Wendy hugged Nana. "Cuddle her," he shouted. "Nobody cuddles me. I refuse to allow that dog in my nursery." "George," Mrs. Darling whispered, "remember that boy." Alas, he would not listen, and he dragged Nana from the nursery into the yard. Meanwhile, Mrs. Darling put the children to bed. "Can anything harm us, Mother?" yawned Michael, "after the night lights are lit?" "Nothing can harm you, my dear," she said. Later on, the stars watched Mr. and Mrs. Darling making their way along the snow-covered street. As soon as the door of number 27 closed on them, the smallest star in the Milky Way screamed out, "Now, Peter!" And here you'll see the shadow and Nana the dog. There was another light in the room now, looking for Peter's shadow, but it was not really a light. It was a fairy, no larger than your hand. A moment after the fairy's entrance, Peter dropped in. "Tinker Bell," he called softly, "do you know where they put my shadow?" The loveliest tinkle of golden laughter answered him. Peter jumped at the drawer where the tinkle came from, and in a moment he'd found his shadow. Now he'd thought that he and his shadow would just join up like drops of water. And when they did not, he was appalled. He tried to stick it on with soap, but that failed. At last he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy. boy, she said. Why are you crying? And what is your name? Peter bowed graciously to her. Peter Pan, and I can't get my shadow to stick on. Ah, it must be sewn on, said Wendy, and she stitched the shadow onto Peter's foot. Peter jumped about in glee. Oh, how clever I am! Oh, the cleverness of me! But Wendy, one girl is worth 20 boys. Well, that's very sweet of you. I shall give you a kiss, Wendy declared. Now, Peter did not know what a kiss was, so he held out his hand. And Wendy didn't want to hurt his feelings, so she gave him her thimble instead. Now I shall give you a kiss, said Peter, and he dropped an acorn button into her hand. Wendy put his kiss on the chain she always wore round her neck. How old are you, Peter? Asked Wendy. I don't know, Peter replied. I ran away the day I was born. I heard father and mother talking about what I was to be when I became a man, so I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived among the fairies. Sometimes I still do. But mostly I live with the lost boys. They are children who fall out of their prams when the nurse is looking the other way. But we have no female friends. Girls are too clever to fall out of their prams. I think it's lovely the way you talk about girls, said Wendy. I will give you a kiss. A thimble. And then she kissed him. In return, Peter kissed her. But suddenly Wendy screamed. It was Tinker Bell. She was pulling Wendy's hair. At this point, Wendy's night light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other two yawned also, and then all three lights went out. Wendy, fly with me to Neverland, said Peter. Fly? I can't fly, said Wendy. I'll teach you how to jump on the back of the wind, and then away we go. What, can you teach Michael and John too? Well, if you like. Wake up, Wendy cried. Peter Pan has come to teach us to fly. Really, yawned John. Can you really fly? Peter flew around the room. It looked easy, and they tried it from their beds, but they always fell down. What you need to do, said Peter, is think wonderful thoughts. But none of them could fly an inch because Peter had been trifling with them. No one can fly unless fairy dust has been blown on him. Fortunately, one of Peter's hands was messy with fairy dust, and he blew some on each of them. Wriggle your shoulders this way, he said, and let's go. Michael let go first. I flew, he shouted. John let go and met Wendy near the bathroom. Oh, this is lovely, this is fun. Oh, shall we all go out? Cried John. But Wendy hesitated. Oh, I'm not sure. There are mermaids, said Peter, and pirates. Pirates, cried John, seizing his Sunday hat. Let's go at once. And it was just at this moment that Mr. and Mrs. Darling came home from their neighbours. They left number 27. They looked up at the nursery window of their own house and saw 3 figures circling around in the air. No, not 3, 4. Peter knew there was not a moment to lose. Come along, he cried, and soared up and out into the night, followed by John, Michael, Wendy, and of course Tinker Bell. Mr. and Mrs. Darling rushed upstairs and into the nursery, but it was too late. The birds had flown. Second to the right and straight on till morning, Peter told Wendy. That's the way to Neverland. So great was the children's delight in flying that at first they wasted time circling around tall objects that took their fancy. Then they flew over the sea. Sometimes it was dark and sometimes light. And now they were cold and now they were too warm. They went on and on. When they were sleepy, there was danger, for the moment they dropped off to sleep, down they fell. Peter found this funny. "Oh, there he goes again," he'd cry as Michael suddenly dropped like a stone. "Save him!" cried Wendy. And Peter would dive through the air and catch Michael just before he hit the sea. The children could fly strongly now, though they still kicked far too much. If they saw a cloud in front of them, the more they tried to avoid it, the more certainly did they bump into it. Peter showed them how to lie out flat on the wind, and this was so pleasant they tried it several times and found they could even go to sleep safely now. And so they drew closer to Neverland. And after many moons, Peter cried out, "There it is!" Wendy and John and Michael stood on tiptoe in the air to get their first sight of the island. "There's a lagoon," said Wendy. "Wendy, look at the mermaids," said John. "And I can see smoke of the Indian camp," said Michael. It was getting darker. They huddled close to Peter, flying so low that sometimes a tree grazed their faces. Peter sent Tinkerbell off to see what was ahead. "There's a pirate ship beneath us," Peter said. "Are there many pirates on the island?" asked John. "Oh, tons." "Who's the captain of the pirates?" "Hook," answered Peter. "Captain James Hook. I cut off his right hand, and now he has an iron hook instead, and he claws with it. And you must promise me one thing." John went pale. "If we meet Hook in an open fight, you must leave him to me." Tinkerbell was back again. She could not fly as slowly as the others, so she had to go round them in a circle. "Tinkerbell tells me," Peter said, "that the pirates saw us before the darkness came and they got the long tom out." "Is that a big gun?" asked John. "Yes," said Peter. "It's like a big cannon. And if they see Tinkerbell's light, they will guess we are near and they're sure to let it go." "Tell Tinkerbell to go away at once," the three children cried at the same time. But Peter refused. "Then tell her to put her light out, please," begged Wendy. "She can't put it out," said Peter. "It goes out by itself when she falls asleep." "Then tell her to go to sleep at once," John said. "Well, she can't sleep unless she's sleepy," Peter told him. "If only one of us had a pocket we could carry her in it and hide the light." But they'd set off in such a hurry there was not a pocket between them. And then Peter had an idea. John's hat. Tinkerbell agreed to travel in the hat, only if it was carried by hand. John took the hat first, then Wendy took it, and this led to mischief, as we shall soon see. They flew on in silence, the stillest silence they had ever known. "If only something would make a sound," Michael cried. And as if in answer, the pirates fired Long Tom at them. The roar of it echoed through the mountains. When at last the heavens were steady, John and Michael found themselves alone in the darkness. Peter had been carried far out to sea, while Wendy had been blown upwards with no companion but Tinkerbell, who at once popped out of the hat. Tinkerbell was not bad, but she was jealous of Wendy, because she knew Peter Pan liked her. She flew backwards and forwards, plainly meaning, "Follow me and all will be well." And Wendy, not knowing that Tinkerbell was tricking her, staggering in her flight, followed the fairy to her doom. Now, down in Neverland, feeling that Peter was on his way back, the lost boys were out to greet their captain. There were 6 of them, Tootles, Nibs, Slightly, Curly and Twins. Behind them were the pirates, and in their midst was Captain James Hook, a terrible man who treated his crew like dogs. On the trail of the pirates came the Indians. They stole noiselessly down the warpath, led by Princess Tiger Lily. Last of all came a gigantic crocodile. Now all of them were going round and round the island, and they'd never met each other because they were all going at the same speed. The first to fall out of the moving circle were the boys. They flung themselves down on the grass, close to their underground home. Then the boys heard the pirates in the distance. Nibs ran off to see what was happening. The others darted down the hollow trees that led to their home underground. As the pirates advanced, one of them, Smee, saw Nibs. Smee's pistol flashed out, but an iron claw gripped his shoulder. "He's only one," said Hook. "I want all 7 of them." The pirates, except Hook and Smee, disappeared among the trees. "I want Peter Pan," Hook said. "It was he who cut off my arm and flung it to a crocodile. And that crocodile has followed me ever since." Hook sat down on a large mushroom. "That crocodile would have had me before this, but by a lucky chance it swallowed a clock which goes tick, tick inside it. Before it can reach me, I hear the tick and bolt." Suddenly he jumped up. "I'm burning!" They examined the mushroom and found it was a chimney. They had discovered the home underground. Hook started to plan how to capture the boys until he heard tick-tock, tick-tock. "The crocodile!" And he bolted. One by one, the boys came out of hiding. Nibs appeared and pointed to the sky. "Oh, there's a great white bird flying this way," he said. It really was Wendy. She was so tired with flying and was moaning, "Poor Wendy," to herself. "There are birds called Wendy's," said Slightly. Then came the shrill voice of the jealous Tinker Bell calling out, "Peter wants you to shoot the Wendy." Tootles had his bow and arrow ready. "Quick, Tootles!" Tinker Bell shouted. Tootles fired, and Wendy fluttered to the ground. The boys crowded round her. "This is no bird," said Slightly. "It must be a lady." "And we have killed her," Nibs said hoarsely. They all whipped off their caps. At this tragic moment, they heard Peter arrive. "Hide her," they whispered, and they gathered round Wendy just before Peter dropped in front of them. "Greetings, boys," he cried. I've brought a mother for you all at last. Have you seen her? She flew this way." They all stood back so that Peter could see Wendy lying there. "Whose is this arrow?" Peter asked. "Mine," said Tootles mournfully. But just then, luckily, Wendy raised her arm. "She lives!" cried Peter, kneeling beside her. "The arrow hit this," he explained as he held up the acorn button on Wendy's necklace. "The kiss I gave her saved her life." Suddenly from overhead came a loud wail. "That's Tinker Bell," said Curly. "She's crying because Wendy's alive." They told Peter of Tinker Bell's crime. "Listen, Tinker Bell," Peter cried. "I am no longer your friend. Be gone from me forever." But she flew onto his shoulder and pleaded, but he brushed her off. And not until Wendy again raised her arm did Peter give in and say, "Well, all right, not forever, but for a whole week you're not my friend." Do you think Tinker Bell was grateful to Wendy for raising her arm? No. She wanted to pinch her. Fairies can be very strange at times. They wondered what they should do with Wendy in her present state of health. "Well, let's carry her down into the house," Curly suggested. "No, you mustn't touch her," Peter said. "Let's build a house all around her." Just then who should appear but John and Michael. "Curly," said Peter, "make sure these boys help build the house." "Build a house," said John. "For the Wendy," said Curly. John was aghast. "But she's only a girl." "That," explained Curly, "is why we are her servants." Well, the astounded brothers were dragged away to hack and carry. "If only we knew what kind of house she likes best," said Nibs. Immediately, without even opening her eyes, Wendy began to recite a verse. "I wish I had the pretty house, the littlest ever seen, with funny little red walls, a roof of mossy green." Well, they rattled up a little house in no time. "There's no door knocker," said Peter. So Tootles gave him the sole of his shoe, and this made an excellent door knocker. "There's no chimney," Peter said. So he snatched the hat off John's head, knocked out the top, and put it on the roof. There was nothing left to do now but to knock at the door. "Now you should all look your best," Peter warned them. "First impressions are very important." Peter knocked politely. The door opened and Wendy came out. "Where am I?" she said. "Wendy, lady," said slightly, "for you we built this house." "And we are your children," cried the twins. They all went on their knees and cried, "Wendy, lady, be our mother." "Should I?" Wendy said. "All right then, I'll do my best. Come inside, you naughty children, I'm sure your feet are damp." By and by, Wendy tucked the boys up in bed in their home underground, while she slept in the little house. Peter kept watch outside, his sword drawn, for the pirates were lurking and wolves were prowling. After a time he fell asleep, and some fairies had to climb over him on their way home from a party. Well, that's the end of part 1. That's half the book, because it's quite a long story to read in one go. So if you'd like to find out what happened, come back soon for part 2. Bye-bye.